After my wife passed away and my sons kicked me out of the house, I was working as a ride-share driver when I picked up a passenger at City General Hospital. An old man climbed into the back seat and instantly froze, staring straight at me. He asked me in a trembling voice if my name was Vance. I told him it was and that my name was Leopold Vance. He started to cry and told me he had been looking for my family for 60 years. He took me to an office and opened an old safe completely covered in dust. His hands shook as he turned the combination dial. He explained that my father had saved his company from bankruptcy back in 1965, but had never received the stock shares he was promised. When he finally opened that safe and showed me the documents, when I saw the accumulated amount of money from decades of growth, I forgot how to breathe. But to understand why that moment simultaneously destroyed and saved me, I need to tell you how I ended up there driving a cab at 73 without family and without hope. 6 months before that day, I had a life. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I had a small house, a wife, Patrice, who had been my partner for 45 years, and 2 sons, Moses and Earl, who I thought loved me. Patrice was everything to me. Every morning, she made coffee with 2 spoonfuls of sugar. That smell of fresh brewed coffee was my routine, my comfort, my home. When cancer took her in March, in less than 3 months, that smell disappeared forever. And with it, everything I knew vanished. The days after the funeral blurred together. Silence, grief, and the echo of laughter that once filled the walls. Moses and Earl visited for the first few weeks. They brought prepared food and empty words. But their eyes were different. They didn't look at me like their father anymore. I was a burden they needed to manage. That solution came on a Tuesday afternoon, 1 month after I buried my wife. Moses showed up holding papers, his expression cold and businesslike. He sat me down at the kitchen table and told me the house was in Patrice's name. Legally, it now belonged to them. They had decided to sell it, said they needed the money for their own families, their own debts. I asked where they expected me to go. Earl couldn't even meet my eyes. He told me I should find a small apartment, something I could afford with my Social Security check. $400 a month. That barely covered groceries, let alone rent. I tried to explain, my voice cracking. Moses just shrugged. "We can't support you, Dad," he said. And that was it. My home, my family, my world, gone. They said they had their own responsibilities. I remember that moment like a blade turning slowly in my chest. My own children, the boys I once carried in my arms, drove to school every morning, taught to ride bikes and tie their shoes, were now throwing me out of my own home as if I were a stranger. 2 weeks later, I was living in a rented room that cost $300 a month. It was barely the size of a closet. The walls were stained a dull yellow, and the air always smelled of dampness and stale cigarette smoke drifting from next door. My only window faced an alley piled high with garbage. There was no kitchen, just a hot plate balanced on a wobbling table, and a small refrigerator that never stopped humming. The bathroom was shared with 3 other tenants, and the mattress springs dug into my back every night. It was all I could afford. Even then, after paying rent, I had only $100 left each month. For food, for everything. The nights were the worst. I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, tracing the water stains that looked like ghosts, listening to the neighbors arguing through paper-thin walls. I kept asking myself how I had ended up there. 73 years of life. 45 years of marriage. 2 sons I raised with love and patience. And now, alone, abandoned, in a room that felt more like a prison than a home. I thought about Patrice constantly. I wondered if she could see me from wherever she was, if she'd forgive me for letting everything fall apart. Hunger doesn't spare pride. After 2 weeks of surviving on bread and canned beans, I knew I couldn't keep living like that. I needed to earn something, anything. So I signed up to drive for a rideshare app. I didn't expect much. Who would hire a 73-year-old man when there were so many young drivers out there? But 2 days later, I got approved. They mailed me a small decal for my windshield and gave me access to the app. That was it. No training, no questions asked. Just drive. The first day behind the wheel, I almost got into 3 accidents. My hands shook on the steering wheel, not from age, but from fear of failing again. My hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. Passengers came and went, some kind, some impatient, most barely looking at me. I tried to stay focused. Don't get lost, don't make mistakes, don't give anyone a reason to complain. Every time I glanced at the rearview mirror, I saw a stranger staring back. A thin, hollow man with deep shadows under his eyes. I had lost more than 20 pounds since Patrice died. I worked 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, from 6 in the morning until 8 at night. My legs swelled until they ached, my back burned with pain that never really went away. But I couldn't stop. Each ride meant $3, maybe $4, sometimes $5. I stopped buying anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. No coffee, no meat, just rice, beans, and cheap bread. Sundays were the worst. They used to be sacred. Patrice would make her roast chicken, the one that filled the whole house with the smell of garlic and rosemary. The boys would come with their families, and the house would ring with laughter. Now Sundays were just another day of driving strangers around, listening to fragments of their happiness while mine slipped further away. Families heading to brunch, old couples holding hands in the back seat. Every trip was a quiet punishment, a reminder of everything I had lost. 4 months went by like that. 4 months of loneliness, exhaustion, and silence. Not one call from my sons. Not a single text. It was as if I had died with Patrice. Some nights, I thought about giving up. But something, maybe her memory, maybe sheer stubbornness, kept me going. Every morning, I'd wake up, stretch my aching legs, and start the engine again. It was a Thursday afternoon when everything changed. A ride request popped up on my screen. Pick up at City General Hospital, destination downtown. $10 fare, maybe. I usually avoided the hospital. Too much traffic, too many people. But that day, I needed every cent. I pulled up to the main entrance and waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I was about to cancel when I saw an elderly man step through the glass doors. He was about my age, walking slowly with a dark wooden cane that looked older than both of us. His gray suit was perfectly pressed, his navy tie neat, his shoes polished to a shine. His white hair was combed back with care, every detail precise. He looked like the kind of man who'd never known struggle. I got out to help him, opened the back door and offered my hand. He looked up and froze, completely still. His face changed, like he'd just seen something impossible. His pale gray eyes went wide. His mouth opened slightly, and his cane began to tremble in his grip. I thought he was having a stroke. I asked if he was all right, if he needed a doctor, but he didn't answer. He just kept staring at me, his expression a mix of shock and recognition, as if he were looking at a ghost. When he finally spoke, his voice came out rough and trembling. He asked me for my last name. I was confused, but I answered. I told him my name, Leopold Vance. The moment the name left my mouth, his eyes filled with tears. Real tears. They gathered, trembled, then slid down his cheeks. He repeated my last name twice, almost in disbelief. Vance. Vance, he whispered, like it was a sacred word. Then, in a trembling voice, he asked if I knew a man named Hector Vance. I froze. For a second, everything around me, the noise, the cars, the world, just stopped. Hector Vance was my father. He had died 30 years ago from a heart attack. I told him that, my voice unsteady. I said yes, Hector was my father, but he'd been gone for a long time. The old man closed his eyes tightly, and more tears spilled out. He whispered something under his breath, too soft for me to hear, and when he opened his eyes again, they held a strange mix of relief, sorrow, and guilt. He looked at me and said, his voice shaking but sure, that he had been searching for my family for 60 years. 60 years. The words barely made sense. I didn't know this man. I had never seen him before in my life. Yet he spoke as if he carried pieces of my family's history, pieces I'd never known existed. Then he asked me, almost pleading, not to take him to the destination listed on the app. He wanted me to drive him to his office instead. He said there was something he needed to show me, something he had kept safe for 6 decades, waiting for this exact moment. Something connected to my father, and a debt that had never been repaid. I didn't know what to say. My thoughts tangled into panic and disbelief. This stranger, crying, shaking, talking about my father like they had shared a lifetime, felt like he had stepped out of another era. I asked who he was, what he wanted from me. He pulled a crisp white handkerchief from his jacket pocket and dabbed his face, apologizing for his reaction. Then he said his name, Alfred. Just Alfred. And with quiet conviction, he told me that what he was about to show me would change my life forever. He looked at me, eyes shining with desperate sincerity, and begged for just one thing, an hour of my time. 1 hour, he said, in exchange for answers I never knew I needed. Something in his voice broke through my hesitation, maybe the honesty, maybe the exhaustion in his tone. I nodded. I helped him into the car. He moved carefully, each step deliberate, as if every breath came with effort. Once seated, he gave me an address in the financial district, the part of downtown where the buildings touched the clouds and the people inside wore suits worth more than my car. We drove in silence. The city buzzed around us, but inside the car, there was only the hum of the engine and the sound of his shallow breathing. Every few seconds, I looked into the rear-view mirror. He stared out the window, eyes distant, lost somewhere decades behind us. Traffic was thick, crawling inch by inch. 40 minutes passed before we finally stopped in front of a 20-story building made of glass and steel, the kind of place where powerful people worked. People with money, with stories that never reached men like me. Alfred asked me to turn off the engine and accompany him inside. I hesitated. I still didn't understand what was going on, but I had come so far that turning back seemed foolish. I got out of the car and helped him down. We walked together toward the main entrance. The lobby was impressive, shining marble floors, glass walls, huge decorative plants in ceramic pots. A security guard behind a counter greeted Alfred by name with obvious respect. We took an elevator that smelled of expensive wood and luxury air freshener. Alfred pressed the button for the 18th floor. The doors closed and we began to ascend in silence. I could hear my own breathing. My heart pounded fast. I didn't know if I was making a terrible mistake or if I was about to discover something important. The elevator doors opened directly into a private office. There was no hallway or reception area, just a dark wooden door with a gold plaque that read Alfred Thorne, President. He took a key from his pocket and opened the door, ushering me in first. The office was enormous, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the entire city, an antique solid wood desk, bookshelves packed with leather-bound books, expensive paintings on the walls. Everything screamed success, power, wealth accumulated over decades. Alfred closed the door behind us and asked me to sit down. He pointed to a brown leather sofa near the windows. I sat down slowly, feeling completely out of place in my worn clothes and old shoes. He walked to a corner of the office where a large painting hung, a seascape in blue tones. He took it with both hands and moved it aside, revealing a safe embedded in the wall. It was old, the kind you see in old movies, with a combination dial in the center and green paint worn away by time. He looked at me before opening it. His eyes were moist again. He told me that what he was about to show me had waited 60 years for this moment, that he had promised to find the Vance family and fulfill a debt that had haunted him his entire life. Then he turned to the safe and began to turn the dial. Left, right, left. Again, I could hear the metallic clicks of the mechanism. My breathing had become shallow. I didn't know what to expect, but I felt my life was about to change in a way I couldn't yet comprehend. The safe door opened with a screech of rusty hinges. Alfred reached in and pulled out an old leather folder, worn at the corners. He placed it on his desk and motioned for me to approach. I got up from the sofa, my legs trembling. I walked to the desk and stood in front of the folder. He opened it carefully as if it were something sacred. Inside were documents yellowed with age, black and white photographs, and what appeared to be antique stock certificates. Alfred pulled out an old photograph and handed it to me. It showed 2 young men standing in front of a small building. One of them was clearly Alfred, maybe 50 years younger, with dark hair and a big, easy smile. But it was the other man who made my chest tighten. He looked exactly like me. The same eyes. The same nose. The same jawline. He wore oil-stained overalls and rested a hand on Alfred's shoulder, the kind of gesture that spoke of genuine friendship. I didn't even need to ask, but I did anyway. Alfred nodded, confirming what my heart had already whispered. The man in the photo was Hector Vance, my father. I dropped into the chair in front of Alfred's desk, the weight of it all hitting me at once. My knees felt weak. Alfred sat down too, his voice calm but steady as he began to talk. A story, he said, that had stayed locked inside him for 60 years, waiting for this moment. Back in 1965, Alfred was a 30-year-old businessman who had just inherited his father's small textile factory. Things were falling apart fast. He'd made bad decisions, trusted the wrong people, and the company was drowning in debt. The banks refused him loans. Creditors were circling like vultures. He was on the brink of losing everything. One night, desperate and half-drunk, Alfred wandered into a bar near the factory, hoping to forget his troubles for a while. That's where he met my father. Hector worked as a mechanic in a nearby garage, a humble man with rough hands and grease-stained clothes, but with eyes that told you he was honest to his core. They started talking. Alfred, hopeless and a little drunk, poured out his whole story to this complete stranger. The debts, the lawsuits, the collapse of the family business. My father just listened quietly. And then, he did something that would change both their lives. He told Alfred he had some savings. Not much, but enough. Money he had been putting away for years, hoping to buy a small house someday. And he offered it, all of it, to Alfred, a man he'd met only hours earlier. Alfred thought it had to be a joke. Who would hand over their life savings to a stranger in a bar? But my father wasn't joking. 2 days later, they met again at a bank. Hector withdrew $30,000, in 1965, a fortune for a mechanic, and handed it to Alfred in cash. It was everything he had. Overwhelmed by the kindness, Alfred swore he'd repay every penny with interest, and even promised my father a 30% share in the company once things turned around. They wrote a simple agreement on a paper napkin. My father didn't ask for anything more official. He trusted Alfred's word. And Alfred used that money to pay off the debts that had been choking him. With that money, Alfred finally caught his breath. He was able to talk to the creditors again, this time from a position of strength. He struck new deals, secured a few small contracts, and somehow, slowly, the factory began to stand on its own feet again. Within 6 months, it was making a profit. Within a year, it had doubled in size. Thorn Textiles had been saved. And the very first thing Alfred did was go looking for my father. He went back to the garage where Hector used to work, but they told him my father had quit 2 months earlier. No one knew where he had gone. Alfred went to the address he had written down, the small house near the factory, but it was empty. The neighbors said the man who lived there had left suddenly, leaving no forwarding address. It was as if my father had simply disappeared. Alfred didn't give up. He hired private investigators, placed ads in newspapers, even offered rewards. But nothing came of it. Years passed. Decades, even. And still, no trace of Hector Vance. Meanwhile, Thorn Textiles grew, from a small local factory into one of the largest textile corporations in the country. And with each passing year, the value of that 30% share grew right along with it. But Alfred never touched it. Never sold a single share. He kept them all locked away, waiting, for 60 years, in the hope that one day, Hector or someone from his family would come. And then today, by pure chance, I got into his car. The moment he saw me, Alfred said, he knew. He saw the face of his old friend again. The same eyes, the same jawline, the same quiet strength that had once saved him from ruin. Alfred reached into his desk and opened a folder. Inside was an old stock certificate, Hector Vance, 30% of Thorn Textiles Incorporated, still crisp, still valid. Then he laid down another sheet, a recent valuation report. When I saw the number printed on it, my vision went white for a moment. I blinked, thinking I had misread it. $32 million. That was what my father's shares were worth today. $32 million, sitting untouched in that safe for 60 years. I couldn't believe it. My hands started to shake as I held the papers. My throat tightened, and the room seemed to tilt around me. I wanted to laugh, to cry, to run, but I couldn't even speak. $32 million. And me, the person who had been scraping by on $100 a month, eating canned beans and cheap bread, living in a room barely big enough for a bed, was suddenly, impossibly, a millionaire. Alfred came around the desk and put a hand on my shoulder. His touch was gentle, almost fatherly. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "Do you need water? Something stronger?" I shook my head. I didn't need water. I needed answers. Why had my father disappeared? Why had he never told me any of this? Why had he walked away from everything that could have changed our lives forever? Why had my father died a poor man when fortune had been waiting for him all along? Alfred seemed to sense the question forming in my mind. Before I could speak, he began to talk, slowly, thoughtfully, as if the words had been sitting in his chest for years. He told me that he'd asked himself that same question countless times over the decades. He had come up with a dozen possible explanations, though none had ever satisfied him. "Maybe," he said, "your father was afraid of what that kind of money could do to a person. Maybe he didn't trust the business world. Can't say I'd blame him. Maybe something personal forced him to leave town in a hurry. Or maybe he was simply a man who valued his peace more than wealth." Alfred sighed. "I never knew for sure. But I do know this. Hector Vance was the most honorable man I ever met. He gave everything he had to help a stranger, and he never asked for anything in return." I swallowed hard, then asked the question that had been burning inside me. "Why did you keep the shares all this time? 60 years, Alfred. You could have sold them, used them, anything. Why didn't you?" Alfred smiled faintly, a sadness flickering in his eyes. "Because I made a promise," he said quietly. "And a man without his word is nothing. I owed your father everything. The success, the company, the life I built. Without that $30,000 in 1965, I would have lost everything. I would have ended up on the street. Hector gave me a second chance when nobody else would. The least I could do was keep my word, no matter how long it took." He opened a drawer and pulled out more documents. Dusty ledgers, financial statements, dividend reports that had accumulated year after year. He showed me photographs of factories expanding, workers standing proudly in front of new buildings, old newspaper clippings marking milestones. Thorne Textiles had become an empire. 43 factories in 8 countries. Over 20,000 employees. Hundreds of millions in annual revenue. And 30% of it, all of it, had always belonged to my father. I looked at Alfred, my voice barely above a whisper. "After all these years, how did you recognize me so easily?" He chuckled softly, the sound filled with nostalgia. "I could never forget that face," he said. "For decades, I looked at that photograph at least once a week. I memorized every line of it. When I saw you by my car that day, it was like seeing Hector again. The same eyes. The same way you tilt your head when you think. It was impossible not to recognize you. I knew instantly you had to be his son." Alfred stood and walked toward the window. The city stretched below us, glowing softly in the afternoon light. He turned slightly, his voice quieter now. "I'm 85, he said. "And I've been sick these last 2 years. Lung cancer. The doctors give me maybe 6 months, if I'm lucky." He paused, looking out over the skyline. "I'd already made peace with the idea that I'd never find your father's family before I died. But life, or fate, or maybe God himself decided otherwise. Somehow, your car ended up in front of mine that day. I think that was no coincidence." The image of that moment kept looping in my mind, like an old record stuck on repeat. I thought of my tiny, cluttered room, the endless hours driving strangers around for a living, and the heavy silence for my sons who no longer called. 6 long months of humiliation and quiet suffering had collapsed into a single, unbelievable hour. My life had changed completely, almost absurdly fast. But what surprised me most wasn't the rush of joy or disbelief that I had expected. It was sorrow. A quiet, aching sadness for my father, for never truly knowing him, never understanding the kind of man he was while he was still alive. Alfred must have seen something in my face. He told me that what my father had done for him wasn't about money. It was about the kind of person he was. His integrity, his decency, his instinct to help someone when no one else would. "That can't be bought or sold," Alfred said softly. "That was your father's real legacy." And in that moment, I realized that legacy lived in me too. I carried his name, his features, his blood, and maybe even the same quiet strength I hadn't yet recognized in myself. The money, Alfred said, was just a symbol, a material reflection of a moral debt. The true inheritance was knowing that I came from such an extraordinary man. I asked Alfred if I could keep the photograph, the one of him and my father standing together in front of the old factory. He smiled, almost relieved, and handed it to me at once. "I've had copies made," he said. "This one's been on my desk for 60 years. I've looked at it thousands of times, thinking about the friend who saved my life. It's only right that you have it now." I took the photo carefully, my hands trembling. My father looked impossibly young in it, smiling at the camera with that open, genuine expression that only good people seem to have. He had no idea that he'd just changed someone's destiny. He wasn't doing it for recognition or reward. He was just being himself, a good man doing what was right. A moment later, Faye returned with an older man in a dark suit carrying a worn leather briefcase. Alfred introduced him as Stephen, his attorney and the company's legal director for 3 decades. Stephen shook my hand firmly, his expression thoughtful, almost reverent. As Alfred explained the situation, Stephen nodded, as though this was something long anticipated. Perhaps he, too, knew the story. Perhaps many of Alfred's circle did. Stephen opened his briefcase and laid out a neat stack of documents. In a measured but kind voice, he explained that they'd need my ID, proof of address, birth certificate, and my father's death certificate to process the transfer of shares. DNA testing would also be required, to confirm, beyond any doubt, that I was truly Hector Vance's son. It was, he said, simply procedure for a matter of such magnitude. It wasn't that they doubted who I was, Stephen made that clear, but legally, they needed to protect themselves from any future disputes. I nodded and told him I understood completely. I'd do whatever was required. He smiled kindly and said the entire process would take about 2 weeks. Then he added something that left me stunned. Alfred had authorized an advance to cover any immediate needs, $50,000, to be deposited into my account the next day. I nearly lost my balance in the chair. $50,000. It was more money than I'd ever seen at once in my entire life. My throat went dry as Stephen handed me a stack of bank forms to complete. My hands were shaking so badly that my signature looked like a stranger's handwriting. Alfred stood up slowly, leaning on his cane, and walked toward me. When he reached out to shake my hand, he clasped it with both of his skin warm and trembling slightly. He looked me straight in the eyes and spoke words that will stay with me forever. He said his life had been blessed the day he met my father. That every good thing that had followed from that moment in a smoky bar so many decades ago had been built on the kindness of a mechanic who didn't owe him anything. He said he had spent 60 years wishing he could look Hector Vance in the eye and say thank you. But since he could no longer do that, he was saying it to me. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for being the son of that extraordinary man. Thank you for showing up when I had lost hope. And thank you for allowing me to leave this world in peace." My voice broke when I tried to reply. I told him that I should be the one thanking him, that words could never express what this moment meant to me. But Alfred just shook his head gently. "Don't thank me," he said. "This isn't generosity. It's justice. It's the fulfillment of a promise. I've merely been the caretaker of something that always belonged to your family." For the next hour, Stephen and I went through documents, questions, and memories. He asked for my father's date and place of birth, the names of relatives, every detail that could help establish the lineage. He typed quietly, occasionally nodding, explaining that he'd begin a formal investigation to ensure no other heirs could claim the shares. When he asked if I wanted to include my sons, Moses and Earl, I hesitated. Their faces flashed in my mind, the anger, the cold dismissal, the moment they told me to leave my own house. The silence that followed. I swallowed hard and told him no, the shares would be transferred to me alone. I'd decide later what to do. Stephen accepted my answer without comment. Alfred watched quietly from his chair. I could tell he understood. He saw the pain behind my decision, but, mercifully, he didn't ask. He simply nodded in silence, as if giving me his support. When we finished the paperwork, Alfred insisted that Faye drive me back to my car, which was still parked in front of the hospital. I protested, saying I could take a cab, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. He said he had waited 60 years, and the least he could do was ensure I got home safely. Faye was efficient and kind. During the drive, she asked if I was okay, if I needed to stop anywhere. I thanked her but told her I just wanted to get back to my car. When we arrived at the hospital and I saw my car parked in the patient pickup zone, I realized something surreal. Just 2 hours ago, I was a desperate ride-share driver picking up passengers to survive. Now I was a potential millionaire. Nothing had changed physically. The car was the same. I was the same, but everything was completely different. Faye handed me a business card with Stephen's direct number and told me to call him if I had any questions or needed anything. She wished me good luck, and left. I stood next to my car for several minutes, unsure what to do. People were going in and out of the hospital. Ambulances arrived with sirens blaring. Life continued normally for everyone but me. I took out the photograph Alfred had given me. I looked at my young, smiling father. I tried to imagine the moment he decided to give all his savings to a stranger. What went through his mind, if he was afraid, if he hesitated, or if he simply saw someone who needed help and acted without thinking too much because it was the right thing to do. I got into the car and sat in the driver's seat with my hands on the wheel. My phone buzzed with notifications from the app. Trip requests were waiting, people who needed transportation. I looked at the notifications, then at my father's photograph. I thought about everything that had just happened. Alfred crying when he saw me, the old safe, the yellow documents, the $32 million, my miserable life of the last few months, my sons who abandoned me, Patrice, who wasn't here to see this. I started the engine and drove back to my room. Traffic was heavy and the sun was beginning to set. The city lights flickered on one by one. I thought about how in a few weeks my life would be completely different. I could buy a house, a new car, decent clothes, real food. I could quit working. I could live the rest of my days with dignity. But the strange thing was that none of those things excited me. The only thing I felt was a deep hole in my chest, a sadness for my father for not having truly known who he was, for not having been able to tell him I was proud of him while he lived. I reached my building when it was already dark. I climbed the narrow stairs to my small third-floor room and opened the door to the same smell of damp air that always lingered there. I turned on the light and looked around at the mess that now felt different. The unmade bed, the greasy hot plate, the stained walls, everything seemed heavier and more miserable because I knew soon I would leave this place behind forever. I sat on the bed and placed the photograph on the small table beside me. I looked at my father's face for a long time and finally I spoke even though the room was empty. I whispered, thank you for being who you were, for your kindness, for giving me this gift without ever knowing it, for teaching me by example, even if I was too blind to see it before now. I lay back on the bed and set the photograph on the bedside table. I stayed awake for hours trying to piece together who my father really had been. The quiet mechanic I grew up with was only one side of him. There was another man hidden behind that simple life, a man who could give everything he had just to help a stranger. His single act of compassion had somehow traveled across 60 years to find me when I needed it most. The hours dragged by. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Alfred's tearful face. The yellow documents, the impossible number 32 million, echoing in my head like a prayer. I got up several times to check my wallet to make sure Stephen's card was still there, to make sure it had all really happened and I wasn't imagining it out of desperation. When the first light crept through the window, I made instant coffee on the hot plate. It tasted terrible, but it was all I had. Around 9 in the morning, I called Stephen. He answered quickly, his voice calm and kind, and asked how I was, whether I had rested. I told him the truth, that I had barely slept at all. He chuckled softly and said that was normal after news like this. He confirmed that the $50,000 advance would be in my account before noon and asked if I had an active bank account. I said yes, though it barely had a single dollar in it. Stephen told me to come to his office later that afternoon to begin the formal documentation. He asked me to bring any proof of my identity, my birth certificate, and whatever I had showing my connection to Hector Vance. I didn't have much, only my old ID, a fragile birth certificate I had kept for no real reason, and a few photographs of my father from when I was a child. Stephen said that would be enough to start, and that his team would handle the rest. I spent the morning gathering those papers from a dusty shoebox beneath my bed and found the birth certificate folded yellow with age. I found a few old photographs buried deep in the box. One of me as a boy, one of Patrice young and radiant before life had worn her down, and some of my sons when they were still smiling babies, their faces full of light and innocence. I also found my father's ID, which I had for some reason kept all these years since his death 3 decades ago. The moment I saw it, a knot formed in my throat. There he was, younger than I remembered, staring straight at the camera with that same serious expression and those same eyes I now saw each morning when I looked in the mirror. At 11:30 my phone buzzed with a sudden notification. A deposit of $50,000 had been credited to my account. I froze, staring at the screen, unable to take in what I was seeing. I refreshed the app again and again, thinking it had to be a mistake. But it was real. The money was there, ready to withdraw. 24 hours earlier it would have been an impossible dream. I needed to see it for myself, so I left the room and walked 6 blocks to the nearest bank. My hands were damp with sweat, even though the air conditioning was blasting cold air. I waited in line, feeling the weight of every second. When it was finally my turn, I asked the teller to check my balance. She typed something on her keyboard, then looked up at me differently, not with the usual disinterest, but with a kind of quiet respect. She confirmed the amount, $50,215, the extra $215 being all I had before. I asked to withdraw $1,000 in cash. She nodded, processed the transaction, and handed me 10 fresh $100 bills, so new they almost crackled when I touched them. I slipped them into my wallet and walked out of the bank, feeling as if the world could somehow see that something had shifted inside me, even though on the outside I was still the same tired man in worn-out clothes and cracked shoes. I walked down the street, seeing everything with new eyes. The shops, the people, the laughter spilling from cafes, everything seemed brighter somehow. I stopped in front of a restaurant I had passed 100 times but never entered because I couldn't afford it. This time I walked in and sat by the window. I ordered breakfast without glancing at the prices of scrambled eggs with ham, crispy bacon-buttered toast, freshly squeezed orange juice, and hot coffee in a porcelain cup. When the food arrived, I had to blink away tears. The taste of the bacon, the warmth of the coffee, the softness of the eggs, it all felt like grace, like a piece of my dignity had quietly returned. After eating, I went to a clothing store and bought a dark gray dress shirt, a clean white undershirt, and black shoes not worn or broken. The total was $210. A week earlier, spending that much money would have ruined my whole month, but now I hardly felt it. I paid in cash and left the store carrying the bags in my hands, feeling a strange mix of relief and guilt for doing something just for myself. When I got back to my room, I changed clothes and stood in front of the small cracked mirror hanging on the damp wall. In those new clothes I looked different, more dignified, less beaten down, less invisible. But I was still the same man who had lived in quiet poverty for years, the same man whose own children had turned their backs without hesitation. New clothes couldn't heal the pain, but they were a beginning, a small step toward something better. That afternoon I went to Stephen's office in the same tall building where I had been with Alfred the day before, but on a different floor. The receptionist greeted me with a practiced smile and led me into a large conference room with a polished mahogany table and leather chairs. Stephen was already there, surrounded by neat stacks of documents. He greeted me warmly like an old friend and asked me to sit in the main chair. For the next 2 hours we went through endless papers together. He explained each form carefully before I signed it: affidavits, identification documents, authorizations for genealogical research, and consent forms for DNA testing. Every detail had to be perfect and legal so that no one could challenge my right to the inheritance later on. In the middle of the afternoon, a medical technician arrived to take a DNA sample. The process was simple and quick. A cotton swab pressed gently inside my cheek for half a minute, and it was done. Stephen told me they would compare my DNA with samples taken from the hospital where my father had died 30 years ago. The records of deceased patients were still stored there, and that would be enough to confirm without question that I was his son. He said the results would take about a week to come back. Meanwhile, his team had already begun digging deeper into my father's life. They had found employment records proving that Hector Vance had worked as a mechanic in several city garages between 1960 and 1980. They uncovered his marriage certificate to my late mother and the birth certificates of me and my 2 brothers who had passed away long ago. Everything fit perfectly with what Alfred had said. His story, told through tears, had been completely true. Stephen then asked about my current situation. His voice is calm but filled with concern. I told him everything about Patrice and the cancer that took her in 3 months, about Moses and Earl throwing me out of the house to sell it, about the small room I rented for $300 a month, about driving rides at 73 just to eat each day. Stephen listened quietly the whole time, nodding every so often, his face serious and thoughtful. When I finished talking, he leaned forward and spoke in a calm, steady voice that filled me with something I had almost forgotten. He told me that all the pain and struggle I had endured would soon be behind me. Within 2 weeks at most, I would have full legal control of the inherited shares. I could sell them all if I wanted instant money, sell a portion or keep them and live from the annual dividends. Then he told me the number. The dividends alone were worth around $2 million a year. $2 million every year without selling a single share, without touching the original capital. I sat frozen. $2 million a year. I had been living on $400 a month from Social Security. I had eaten canned beans and stale bread just to survive. I couldn't grasp what he was saying. The numbers didn't seem real, like he was speaking in another language meant for someone else. Stephen must have noticed, because he stopped and asked gently if I needed water or a break. I nodded weakly, and he called his assistant, who brought a glass of cold water. I drank slowly, feeling the coolness run down my throat, calming the storm in my head. Stephen waited without rushing me. When I finally found my voice again, he continued explaining my options. He strongly advised me to hire a reliable financial advisor, someone experienced in handling large inheritances. He handed me a small list of 3 names of professionals who worked with wealthy clients and could help me manage the fortune wisely, protect it from scams, and prevent reckless mistakes. Then his tone became serious. He told me not to make any sudden decisions, not to buy expensive things, and not to share the news with too many people. He said to let the reality sink in first, to take a few weeks to breathe before changing anything. He spoke with the weariness of someone who had seen too many tragedies. People who had inherited wealth and lost it in months because they acted impulsively. He didn't want me to be one of those stories. I thanked him deeply and promised I would be cautious. Then I asked what had been haunting me since yesterday. I asked Alfred whether he was all right after everything we had talked about, considering his fragile health. Stephen's expression softened into a sad smile, though there was a trace of peace in his eyes. He said Alfred was better than he had been in years, that the cancer still advanced without mercy, but now he could face death free from the burden that had weighed on him for so long. He had called his children and grandchildren the night before and told them everything about Hector Vance, and how after 60 years he had finally found his family. Stephen told me that Alfred had cried tears of joy on the phone the night before, that he had told his family he could finally die in peace because he had fulfilled the most important promise of his life. Stephen said Alfred was deeply grateful that I had appeared exactly when I did. He called it a miracle, the answer to 60 years of silent prayers. Hearing that made my chest tighten. I asked Stephen to give Alfred a message from me. Tell him I said thank you. I told him that I understand what it means to keep a promise for 6 decades, that I know how rare that kind of loyalty is. Tell him my father chose the right man to help that night in the bar. Stephen promised to repeat my words exactly as I said them. I left the office around 5 in the afternoon. The sun was still high, the air warm and golden. The city hummed with the chaos of rush hour cars, horns, people hurrying home. I walked with no destination, just letting my thoughts carry me. I kept thinking about how my entire life had shifted in less than 2 days, and how a simple act of kindness from my father 60 years ago had stretched through time to find me now when I needed it most. It felt as if he had known somehow that one day his compassion would return to me, like a gift planted long ago finally blooming. I stopped at a small park and sat on a wooden bench under a wide old tree. I took the photograph from my pocket, the one Alfred had given me. I looked at it for a long time, my young father smiling beside his friend, unaware that their moment together would ripple across generations. I thought of my father as I had known him, covered in grease, his back bent over engines, his rough hands fixing what others had broken. He never complained, never talked about sacrifice, just worked quietly with a kind of patient dignity. Now I understood he had been greater than I ever realized, capable of saving a life and never once mentioning it. I wondered why he never claimed the shares, why he left the city and disappeared without asking for what was rightfully his. Alfred believed maybe he was afraid of the money or forced to leave, but I knew better. My father never cared about wealth. He helped because it was right, not because he wanted something in return. When he saw Alfred safe and his business thriving, he must have felt his purpose was complete. The thought made me look inward and ask myself what kind of man I had been compared to him, what I had done with the life he gave me, and whether I had ever lived with the same quiet grace. Those days passed slowly, filled with long walks through the city and quiet hours of thinking. I spent a lot of time reflecting on my life, on the choices I had made, on the man I had become, and on the kind of man I wanted to be now that life was giving me a second chance. My thoughts often drifted to my sons Moses and Earl and how they had treated me. A small part of me wanted to call them to boast about my fortune, to show them that despite everything I had survived and even triumphed. But another part of me, a wiser, calmer voice, told me that would be meaningless. That was not the kind of thing my father would have done. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after meeting Alfred, my phone rang. It was Stephen. His voice was gentle but heavy, and I knew something was wrong before he even spoke. He told me Alfred had passed away that morning at home, surrounded by his family. The cancer had finally taken him, but he had gone peacefully. Stephen said Alfred had died happy, that he had fulfilled his promise, that he had found the Vance family and kept his word. His last words had been full of gratitude for my father and for me for appearing when I did. When the call ended, I sat there in silence before the tears came. I cried for a man I had known for only a short time, yet who had completely changed my life. I cried for the friendship he had shared with my father 60 years ago, for the promise he had kept for a lifetime, for the rare goodness that still existed in this world. Alfred Thorne had been an extraordinary man, and I had been lucky enough to know him even briefly before he was gone. 3 days later, Stephen asked me to come to his office for the final transfer. I arrived early, wearing the new clothes I had bought weeks before. The receptionist guided me into the same conference room where we had worked earlier. Stephen was there along with 2 lawyers and a public notary. On the table was a neatly arranged stack of documents waiting for my signature. We spent nearly an hour signing everything. My hand trembled slightly each time I wrote my name. The notary checked my identification repeatedly while the lawyers explained each paper: property deeds, stock certificates, tax forms, and authorizations. It felt overwhelming, but Stephen guided me through it patiently, step by step. Finally, everything was done, the signatures complete, the seals stamped, and the documents certified. Stephen handed me a thick leather folder containing all the originals and told me that from that moment I officially owned 30% of Thorne Textiles Incorporated, making me one of the main shareholders in one of the largest textile companies in the country. He added that soon the board would invite me to meet them, and that I would have a voice and a vote in company matters if I wished. But the most important thing was that for the first time in years I had real choices in front of me. I could sell the shares right away. Stephen said there were already several interested buyers and that the current market value was around $32 million, maybe even more if I negotiated well. Or I could keep the shares and live off the dividends, $2 million every year without ever touching the principal. Or maybe I could do a bit of both, sell part of them for immediate cash and hold the rest for steady long-term income. I told Stephen I needed time to think, that this was too big a decision to make in a rush. He nodded in full agreement and reminded me again about the financial advisors on his list, saying they could help me build a plan that matched my needs and goals. I promised I would consider it seriously. When I left his office, I carried the leather folder under my arm, feeling its weight not for what it physically was, but for what it represented. Those papers were the ending of a story that had started 60 years ago, a story of my father's generosity, of Alfred's gratitude for a promise that had endured through time. Now it all rested with me. It was my turn to honor that legacy. I walked to a small park nearby and sat down on a bench beneath a wide tree. I opened the folder and looked at the documents one by one. My name was on every page: Leopold Vance, owner of millions. It felt unreal. Just a month earlier I had been driving a cab 12 hours a day, scraping together enough money to buy beans and bread. Now I am a millionaire. Yet what I felt was not wild excitement. It was something quieter and deeper. Gratitude, a sense of responsibility, a desire to do something worthwhile with what I had been given. I thought of Alfred's words from that first meeting, how he said my father valued integrity more than any fortune, How he had helped without expecting a single thing in return. That was the real lesson. The money mattered, of course, it would give me comfort and security, but the true inheritance was the example my father had left behind to live with decency and kindness even when no one is watching. I pulled out my phone and stared at the names of Moses and Earl. For a moment I thought of calling them, telling them everything, watching their faces when they learned the truth, seeing if regret would touch them. But I set the phone down. It wasn't the time. I needed to decide first what kind of man I would be in this new life, whether I would use wealth to punish or to heal. Patrice once told me the real measure of a person is not how they act when they have everything, but how they act when they have lost it all. And I had lost everything once before. I had already fallen as far as a person could fall. I had lived through poverty, humiliation, and loneliness. Now that life was finally lifting me up again, I faced a choice. I could become bitter and angry, or I could become better, someone who lived in a way that honored my father's memory. The sun was setting when I finally stood up from the park bench. I placed the leather folder carefully back into my old backpack and began walking toward my room for what I knew would be the last time. Tomorrow I would start looking for a new place, somewhere decent, somewhere that reflected the life I was stepping into. But tonight I would sleep there one final time as a way to say goodbye to the place that had kept me alive during the darkest months of my life. The next morning I woke early with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. I knew exactly what I needed to do. First, get out of that miserable room. Second, contact one of the financial advisors Stephen had recommended. Third, and hardest of all, deciding what to do about my sons, though that could wait. The first step was to build a stable foundation for this new life. I called the first advisor on the list, a man named Robert Sanford, who had 30 years of experience managing large estates. His assistant answered and set an appointment for that afternoon. After that I searched online for apartments. I found a furnished 2-bedroom in a safe modern building with security for $2,500 a month. 2 months earlier that price would have seemed impossible. Now it felt reasonably, almost modest. I called the owner and we agreed to meet the next day. Meeting Robert was an unexpected comfort. He was in his 50s, bald, and wore glasses. There was something calm and grounded about him. He didn't try to overwhelm me with technical language or financial jargon. He spoke plainly and directly, which I appreciated. I told him everything, my whole story from Patrice and my sons to the miserable room to Alfred and the shares. He listened quietly without interrupting, then leaned back in his chair and thought before replying. He told me I had 2 main options. The first was to sell everything right away. That would give me around $32 million in cash, and if I invested it wisely and conservatively, I could live comfortably for the rest of my life with about $1.5 million a year in income without ever touching the principal. The second option was to keep all the shares and live off the $2 million in annual dividends, letting the value continue to grow over time. Then he offered a third idea. A balanced plan. Sell half the shares for $16 million, use $10 million to invest safely for steady income, keep $6 million as an emergency reserve for important expenses, and hold on to the remaining half to continue earning about $1 million each year in dividends. That plan gave me the best of both worlds: immediate security and long-term stability. It made perfect sense, and I told Robert to go ahead with it. He outlined the next steps clearly. He would reach out to potential buyers for the shares, negotiate the highest possible price, and structure my new investments into a diversified portfolio made up of bonds, index funds, and real estate, all designed to keep risk low while generating steady income. He said the entire process would take about a month to finalize. During that month, my life transformed in ways I could never have imagined. I moved into the new apartment. It was bright, clean, and filled with light streaming through large windows. I had a real kitchen where I could cook again. A bathroom with hot water that never ran out, a soft bed that didn't jab springs into my back. For the first time in months, I slept through the night without pain. I bought new clothes, not luxury brands, but comfortable, well-made clothes that fit me properly. I stocked the kitchen with real food, fresh meat, vegetables, and fruit, things I hadn't tasted in ages. Each meal felt like a small celebration, a quiet victory over the months of struggle. I started gaining back the weight I had lost. My face looked healthier and my eyes clearer. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a man who was finally coming back to life. But every time I enjoyed one of those small comforts, my thoughts returned to my sons. Moses and Earl still knew nothing about what had happened. To them, I was still a broken man driving a cab just to survive. Part of me wanted to keep it that way to let them live with the version of me they had created in their minds. But deep down I knew I couldn't avoid them forever. I would have to face them eventually, not for their sake, but for my own, so that I could close that chapter with peace. Then one afternoon the phone rang. It was Earl, my younger son. His voice sounded strained and uncertain. He asked how I was doing. It was the first time he had called in 4 months. I said I was fine. There was a long pause, and then he told me that he and Moses had been talking, that maybe they had been too hard on me and that they wanted to meet for dinner to talk things through. My heart jumped. I wanted to believe him, to think that maybe they truly regretted how they had treated me, but something in his tone made me hesitate. Still, I agreed. We arranged to meet the next evening at a small Mexican restaurant we used to go to when they were kids. When I hung up, I felt a mix of hope and doubt. I wanted to believe in them again. I decided not to mention the money yet. I wanted to see their hearts before showing my wallet. Moses and Earl arrived together 5 minutes later, looking uneasy, their movements stiff and their smiles forced. We exchanged awkward hugs and sat at a table in the back of the small restaurant. The first few minutes passed with meaningless small talk about traffic and weather, things people say when they do not know what else to say. Then Moses exhaled deeply and began to talk. He said they had been thinking that maybe after Mom's death they had acted too quickly, that they realized it must have been hard for me too. Earl nodded, adding that they felt some guilt about how they had handled the house. I stayed quiet, waiting, because I could feel there was more to come. And then it came. Moses said they had come up with a solution. If I needed a place to stay, they could rent me the service room at Earl's house for $50 a month. He said it would be better than where I was living now. Earl quickly added that I could help around the house with small things, maybe some yard work or washing the car now and then, nothing heavy. I felt a cold stillness spread through my chest. There it was. This wasn't love or remorse, it was pity wrapped in convenience. They were offering to make me their housekeeper, their poor father tucked away in a service room, grateful for scraps. They thought they were being generous and that they were saving me. I looked at them both and saw the faint smile of expectation on their faces, waiting for my gratitude, for my tears of thanks. Instead, I felt calm and almost peaceful. I smiled and said I appreciated the offer, but it wouldn't be necessary, that I had already found a decent place to live. Moses frowned, asking how that was possible on my small pension. I told him simply that I had been lucky, that things had changed. Earl raised his eyebrows and laughed, asking if I had won the lottery. His laughter sounded forced, but I didn't join in. I told them quietly that I had discovered something about their grandfather Hector, something none of us had known, something that had changed everything. Their mocking smiles faded, replaced by confusion. Moses leaned forward, asking what I meant. So I told them. I told them the whole story about Alfred the Bar in 1965, the $30,000, the forgotten shares that had sat untouched for 60 years, and the $32 million that were now mine. Silence filled the table. They just stared at me, mouths open as if the words had broken the air around them. 32 million. The number hanging there between us is unreal and heavy. Earl was the first to speak, his voice trembling as he asked if I was joking. I looked him straight in the eye and told him no, it was true, and I had all the papers to prove it. Moses leaned forward, his eyes shining with sudden excitement. He began talking quickly, tripping over his own words, saying how incredible it was that our family had received such a blessing, that we should celebrate, that we needed to make plans together on how to manage all that money as a united family. Earl jumped in, eagerly agreeing, saying they could help me manage everything, that I didn't need to worry, that they would take care of me and the fortune. I sat there listening, watching as they spoke faster and faster, their voices overlapping, filled with sudden energy. I could almost see the calculations in their eyes, the numbers spinning in their minds. And I felt an ache deep in my chest. It wasn't sadness for myself, but for them, for what they had become, for how quickly money had turned their indifference into false affection. 5 minutes earlier they had offered me a service room as charity, and now they were talking about managing my fortune together. I raised my hand to stop them. The table fell silent. In a calm, steady voice, I told them I needed them to listen carefully. I reminded them of what they had done 4 months ago, when they told me to leave my own house, when they said I should find a place to live on my tiny Social Security check. I told them how I had lived since then in a damp room barely big enough to stand and eating beans and bread every day, because it was all I could afford, working 12 hours a day as a ride-share driver at 73 just to stay alive. I told them that through all of it neither of them had called me not once. Not even on their mother's birthday just 2 months after she died. Nothing, no message, no voice, no sign that I still existed. I told them they had erased me from their lives, as if 40 years of being their father meant nothing. Moses opened his mouth to speak, but I raised my hand again and kept going. I told them that when they finally called yesterday, I felt a flicker of hope, stupid hope, that maybe they had realized their cruelty, that maybe they missed me, that maybe they wanted their father back. But instead they offered me a room in exchange for housework, as if I were a servant, not their parent. As if humiliation could be disguised as generosity. Earl tried to speak, stumbling through excuses about good intentions and difficult times. I stopped him again and said I understood perfectly, because actions speak louder than words, and their actions had shown me exactly who they were. Moses softened his tone, his voice pleading, saying they had made mistakes, that they were human, and that they deserved a second chance that the family forgives. I nodded slowly and told him he was right. Family forgives, but forgiveness does not mean forgetting, and it never means pretending nothing happened. True forgiveness, I told them, meant seeing the damage they had caused and truly changing. I said I did not hate them, so maybe someday I could forgive them, but for now I needed distance. I needed to build my new life free from the toxicity of relationships built on greed. I told them they would not see a cent of that money, that it was my inheritance from my father, and that I alone would decide what to do with it. My decision did not include rewarding people who had abandoned me in my most fragile moment. Their faces changed instantly. The polite masks of guilt fell away, leaving anger behind. Moses slammed his palm on the table hard enough to make the silverware jump. He said it was unfair that they were my sons, that they had a right to some of the inheritance, that legally they could fight for it. I stayed calm and told them that legally they had no claim, that the shares were entirely in my name, that my lawyers had insured it, and that if they wanted to sue they were free to try, but they would only waste their money on legal fees. Earl shifted his tone to a softer one, his eyes wet as he said he regretted everything, that if he could go back he would change things, that he loved me, and that the money did not matter, that he just wanted his father back. I wanted to believe him. God knows how much I wanted to believe him. But pain has a way of teaching clarity, and I had learned that words are easy while actions are truth, and for 4 long months their actions had been silence and absence. I stood from the table, took out my wallet, and left enough to cover my part of the check that we never ordered. I told them I hoped one day they would understand what my father had taught me by his example, that life was not about collecting wealth, but about living with integrity, about helping others without expecting reward, about keeping promises even when no one is watching. That was the legacy I had inherited. The money was only the symbol of something far greater. I told them the door was not closed forever. If they ever showed real change, if they proved through action, not words, that they had learned something, then maybe we could rebuild, but it would have to be on my terms, not because of guilt or money, but because they truly wanted to be my sons again. Then I walked out of the restaurant without turning back. I heard Moses shouting something, but I didn't stop. I got into my new car and drove toward my apartment. For the first time in months I felt free from pain, free from expectations, free from needing the approval of those who never deserved it. That night I sat on my balcony drinking real coffee and watching the lights of the city, feeling at peace. I thought of my father, Alfred, of the promise kept for 60 years, of how an act of kindness can travel through time, creating ripples that touched lives decades later. My father never knew that his generosity would eventually save me. But it did. And now it was my turn to decide what to do with that gift. I decided to create a foundation in my father's name. The Hector Vance Foundation, dedicated to helping seniors in need. People like I had been just months ago, homeless, hopeless, abandoned by their families. We would give them dignified housing, food, medical care, but above all, dignity. Because I had learned that losing your dignity hurts more than losing your money. And not all the money would go to the foundation. I would live comfortably. I would travel. I would enjoy the years I had left. But a significant portion would be dedicated to continuing the legacy of kindness that my father began 60 years ago in a bar, when he gave everything to a stranger without a second thought. Some debts are too great to pay with just money. But sometimes money is the only way left to say thank you. Thank you, Dad, for teaching me that true wealth is not in what you accumulate, but in what you give. Thank you, Alfred, for keeping your promise when it would have been easy to forget. And thank you, life, for giving me this second chance to live with purpose and meaning. I will dedicate the rest of my days to honoring the legacy of 2 extraordinary men who showed me that kindness never dies. It only waits for the perfect moment to blossom. Let me know in the comments where you have watched it from and if you liked my story. It inspires us to share more such stories for you.